It's the last session of the day, and if you're like me, you're close to being talked out, at least for a while. I need a little bit of R&R, which is in the schedule. Take note, we actually get an hour off. But before that, here's a paper. I want to explain the origin of the paper. I wrote it for a Festschrift for Vigen Goroyan. Some of you may know. He for some time was a professor of religious studies at UVA, and as an Orthodox theologian, was a great contributor to many theological discussions. Edited by Carrie Frederick Frost, and it's just been published. In fact, I thought I'd pass it around the room so people could take a look at it. My apologies for reading a paper that is published, but because the book is brand new, I'm trusting that most people haven't seen it. All right, so let me go ahead and start. Orthodoxy and the transformation of marriage. Orthodox views of marriage and the family fall into two broad camps. Some find in these institutions the opportunity for a rich spiritual life shaped by love, self-sacrifice, and ideally the begetting and raising of godly children. They emphasize the spiritual benefits of the disciplines imposed by marriage and the capacity of love to move us beyond narrow and self-centered forms of thought and feeling. The family on this view constitutes a kind of little church, which, by the way, is a phrase used for it by St. John Chrysostom, that finds its fullest realization in the creation of new life and the shared love and service of God. Others caution against the dangers of viewing any earthly institution through such spiritually charged lenses. They observe that marriage and family, like so many other things, can become an idol, that is, a false god, that is in fact merely a way of validating one's own desires for comfort, love, and security. They emphasize the need for asceticism, even in marriage, and point out that the sexual drive that is at the heart of marriage is inevitably tainted, if not by sin, at least by a certain carnality and desire for pleasure. Sometimes they also express skepticism about the prominence given to the family within contemporary Christianity, particularly appeals to family values and the accompanying cultural politics. Vigen Goroyan is a robust proponent of the first and more positive view of marriage. This is particularly evident in his sustained treatments of the subject in Incarnate Love and the Orthodox Reality. There he begins, as any Orthodox surely must, with the creation account in Genesis. From Genesis we learn that, quote, marriage is founded in a sexual love that, when not deviant, aspires toward perfect union with the other, and that such union is, quote, the primary good of marriage. This does not mean that marriage is an end in itself, however. On the contrary, it is, quote, an eschatological commitment and venture in faith that aims to prepare the married couple and the little church they create for the kingdom of God. Male and female are the elements and symbols of transformation in the sacrament of marriage, much as bread and wine are in the Eucharist. To welcome children as a blessing from God is an integral part of this sacramental transformation. Goroyan has much to say about parenthood and childhood as essential dimensions of Christian marriage. He highlights the role these practices play not only in realizing the fecundity of marriage, but in enabling growth in spiritual maturity and the formation of a familial community centered around the love of God. He also does not shy away from the cultural politics that these commitments often involve, offering vigorous critiques of the campus hookup culture, same-sex marriage, and the general de-Christianization of contemporary society. This is a markedly high view of marriage. Its strength lies in the continuity it finds between our biological identity as male or female and our ultimate destiny as transformed within the kingdom of God. Yet not all Orthodox authors agree in taking such a high view. An interesting counterpoint may be found in a recent essay by Father John Behr. Rather more than Goroyan, Behr emphasizes that marriage is like monasticism in that it is a way of realizing, quote, the fundamental Christian vocation of martyrdom. So far, this might be taken as merely a difference of emphasis, for Goroyan certainly recognizes that marriage often requires sacrifice. But its true meaning becomes clear in their respective treatments of sexuality. Behr argues that one becomes fully human only through a life lived martyrically for Christ. He interprets this conclusion in a way that sharply juxtaposes sexual reproduction with true human identity. Quote, males and females do not in fact beget human beings, but only procreate more males and females, unquote. The consequence for sexuality is that, quote, procreation and sexual activity more generally is inherently in Adam, not in Christ. One cannot procreate in Christ. He also extends the same conclusion to sexual identity itself. Quote, to the extent that we identify ourselves by our sexuality, male or female, or as said today, anywhere on the spectrum between, we are in Adam, not in Christ. By contrast, Goroyan takes it as obvious that Christian marriage, including its sexual dimension, is indeed in Christ. In keeping with this difference, Baer says little about parenthood or children, other than to assert that children are not the goal of marriage, nor does he mention anything positive about either sexual desire or the ordinary, routine domesticity of married life. Broadly speaking, where Goroyan sees continuity between the married state and the Christian telos, Baer sees discontinuity. This difference is hardly without precedent, for it echoes a similar difference among the Greek fathers. St. John Chrysostom, whom Goroyan often cites, offers a view of marriage that finds much value in married sexuality, raising children, and forming a household. His view is in some tension, although not open disagreement, with that of the more platonically inclined fathers, cited by Father Baer, such as St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Maximus the Confessor. For them, the very existence of sexuality is a concession to our fallen nature, and can in no way contribute to our ultimate salvation. Much like Baer, they have little positive to say about sexual desire, the raising of children, or domesticity, seeming to see these as little more than necessary evils. I have elsewhere given my reasons for thinking this platonically inspired view is mistaken. Nonetheless, we must recognize how plausible it was in light of the common experience of marriage in the ancient world. Until well into the Byzantine era, marriage was widely understood as existing for the sole purpose of establishing a common household and producing and raising offspring. The idea that it might also serve higher ends took centuries to percolate into common consciousness. It did so through a long and for the most part not consciously directed process. The result has never received an explicit theological affirmation, save perhaps in the Orthodox wedding service, and remains even today little understood. I will seek here to offer a contribution toward understanding the Orthodox transformation of marriage. In doing so, I have no wish to take sides between the more affirmative and more skeptical views. Both offer important truths that deserve to be heard. My main goal is to point out how the more affirmative view of marriage only became possible because of the development of an Orthodox consciousness in ways that at first glance had nothing to do with marriage. The very possibility of viewing marriage as does Goroyan is a remarkable, although largely unsought, cultural achievement. It deserves to be celebrated even while we remain aware of the cautions put forward by more skeptical voices. So first, a bit about marriage in antiquity. Aristotle devotes a chapter of the Politics to the ideal age for marriage. Questions of love and mutual compatibility do not enter the discussion. The issue, as he frames it, is that of how to maximize the couple's childbearing potential. Since a man, as he believes, remains fertile about 20 years longer than a woman, the man should be roughly that much older at marriage. It's important, too, that both be physically healthy and mature. Hence, he concludes that ideally the woman should be 18 and the man 37. Although most do not reason the matter through with such precision, this discussion illustrates well ancient attitudes toward marriage. As Demosthenes remarked, quote, mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of our persons, but wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households. In practice, Greek women married in their later teens and Greek men about 5 years older. No doubt this age difference alone created a certain initial inequality, but the more significant factors were differences in education and social status. A man was expected to be sexually experienced at marriage, typically with slave girls and prostitutes, whereas a woman entering her first marriage was expected to be a virgin. The man's sexual freedom continued after marriage too, whereas Greek women generally remained sequestered if the family could afford it, and in any case would have been expected to remain strictly faithful. A modern companionate marriage of two equals was out of the question. This is not to say that there was no love in such marriages, but the love was philia, the affection that comes of living and laboring together. As Plato's dialogues attest, passionate desire, or eros, was more commonly between an older man and a male youth. A man could have eros for a woman, as Paris notoriously did for Helen of Troy, but to have eros for one's wife was considered vulgar. Roman women had more freedom than those of the Greeks, but in other respects, Roman practices were even further removed from our own. The legal age of marriage for a Roman girl was 12. As Rodney Stark has observed, there is evidence that some girls were married even younger, although the marriage did not become legitimate until she came of age. Regardless of the bride's age, the marriage was consummated without regard to whether she had passed through puberty. Roman marriage practices were thus consistent with what we would consider to be child rape. Repugnant though such practices are, we must see them in light of the demographic realities of the age. Life expectancy was short, less than 30 at birth, and furthermore, due to the widespread exposure of female infants, there was a dearth of marriageable women. Stark cites a study estimating 1.3 males per female in Rome and 1.4 in the rest of the empire. There was thus immense pressure to produce children. Yet the long-term effect of Roman marriage practices was precisely the opposite of that intended. For men as well as women found marriage under such circumstances unappealing. As Beryl Rawson observed, quote, "One theme that recurs in Latin literature is that wives are difficult and therefore men do not care much for marriage. It could hardly be otherwise when girls were married as children and expected to accept without complaint their husbands' extramarital indulgences. Despite much official encouragement of marriage and children and the legal prohibition of adultery, birth rates remained low and adultery and divorce were commonplace." It was into this world that Christianity was born. Christians were sharply critical of much that they found in society around them, including abortion, infanticide, adultery, divorce, homosexuality, and prostitution, as well as the general atmosphere of licentiousness and debauchery that characterized much of ancient life. They also voted with their feet in less vocal ways that over time had an immense effect. As Stark has shown, Christian girls tended to marry at an older age than their pagan counterparts, due no doubt to the expectation that the marriage would last a lifetime and must therefore be entered into freely. Christian men moved in the opposite direction, marrying younger than their pagan counterparts, because they did not enjoy in the meanwhile the same freedom of sexual exploration. By the Byzantine era, these trends produced an average age of marriage of around 15 for women and 20 for men. This convergence worked with more explicit aspects of Christian teaching, such as the ban on adultery for both sexes, to produce what surely must have been more equal and companionate marriages. What Christians did not do was offer a full-scale program for the reform of marriage. Christianity was not a social reform movement. Abortion and the other acts mentioned were ready targets because they were acts that could be freely renounced by individuals. The very institution of marriage as it then existed, despite its many noxious features, was not an act but simply part of the existing furniture of the world. By the same token, although the early Christians had much to say about right and wrong sexual practices, they did not challenge prevailing assumptions about the very purpose of sex. Pagans tended to approach this subject through a few simple categories. The purpose of sex in marriage was to bear children, and for the husband, at least, sexual release. That of sex outside of marriage was pleasure. Plato had explored the potency of eros as a means of spiritual growth and interpersonal communion, but he had seen these as occurring precisely through the renunciation of sex. And in any case, he focused almost exclusively on the attraction of a man to a male youth. Only in the Renaissance did Christian authors begin with considerable hesitation to explore how the Platonic teaching about eros could apply to the relationship of a man and a woman. We might be inclined to think that the early Christians should have sought to articulate a higher view of sex by drawing on biblical sources. After all, Christ based his teaching about divorce on the evocative statement of Adam when God presented him with Eve. "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." The reference to becoming one flesh places sexual union simultaneously in two lights, as a sign or token of the permanent union of marriage, and as a reunion of man with women who was originally taken from his side. This statement is undoubtedly important for the ontological and moral depth it gives to what might otherwise be mistaken for a merely biological act. However, that very depth means that the value thus assigned to the sexual act is decidedly two-sided. According to St. Paul, sex can also make a person of one flesh with a harlot. The Genesis story thus does not give intrinsic value to sex. Sexuality is like so much else, a power we have that can be used equally for good and for evil. Lest we overlook the obvious, let me add that Christ cites the Genesis passage to exalt not sex, but marriage. Elsewhere he warns against the corrupting power of sexual desire. Whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. St. Paul, too, although he offers a profound interpretation of marriage in Ephesians 5, says little about its physical dimension. Husband and wife are not to deny one another without mutual consent, a commandment that did much to encourage greater equality in marriage. That's 1 Corinthians 7. Yet this passage goes on to recommend celibacy for those who are capable of it, and to present marriage primarily as a remedy for concupiscence. It was partly in deference to these Pauline teachings that the early Christians showed a little interest in exploring the positive potentialities of marriage. But this was far from the whole story. Rather than challenge ancient views of marriage directly, the ancient church executed what might be seen as a kind of end run around the entire marital procreative complex. I would emphasize that to execute such an end run was not its primary purpose. The purpose was to seek Christ, to glorify him, and to live in obedience to his commandments. Nonetheless, the church, in pursuing these ends, revolutionized human society, including how marriage was understood and experienced, as well as how sex came to be viewed in its human and ethical dimension. Much could be said on this subject, beginning with how the Christian understanding of God as one who loves mankind and underwent suffering for our sake was itself revolutionary. However, here I'll concentrate on two factors that I believe were most immediately relevant to marriage. The first was monasticism. A long-standing prejudice holds that the aim of monasticism is to earn salvation or accumulate merit. Whatever may have been the truth of this in some times and places, it has no bearing on early monasticism. For the early monastics, the overriding goal was the recovery of full humanity. This is evident in the life of Antony by St. Athanasius. Athanasius offers a vivid description of Antony's emergence from the abandoned fort, where he spent 20 years alone wrestling with demons. At the end, Athanasius remarks, quote, he maintained utter equilibrium, like one guided by reason and steadfast in that which accords with nature. Later, St. Antony himself explains that virtue is natural and is lost only when the soul departs from its natural condition. For the Lord has told us, the kingdom of heaven is within you. All virtue needs then is our willing, since it is in us and arises from us. For virtue exists when the soul maintains its intellectual part according to nature. It holds fast according to nature what it remains as it was made, and it was made beautiful and perfectly straight. That is the point of the fasting, the isolation, the intense prayer, and warfare with demons, to return the soul to its natural state, where it directly experiences the kingdom of heaven that is within. The rest of the life goes on to describe in detail what Antony was like in this restored and fully natural condition, including his teachings, his miracles, and his victory in debate with pagan philosophers. The description of Antony might seem to bear little connection to sex or marriage. As I've mentioned, we have here not a direct teaching about these subjects, but an end run around the entire way they had been conceived. The ideal Antony describes is not limited to monks alone. It is a vision of the human soul that, if it is true at all, is true for everyone. To the extent that one believes it, one will seek to live accordingly, regardless of one's calling or station in life. Antony does not describe what this would look like for married persons, but any married person who took his teaching seriously could not help but be affected by it. In the succeeding centuries, countless husbands and wives embraced the monastic ideal of holiness as their own, not by becoming monks or nuns, but by incorporating the monastic ethos of self-denial, humility, and constant remembrance of God into their lives as best they could. We might be tempted to think of this as a sort of compromise, but that would be to fall into the mistake of thinking that the monastic life is intrinsically better and more pure than life in the world. It is not. The two are simply different. Now, probably should qualify that in some ways, but we can discuss it later. Part of the difference is precisely that monastics, because they can devote themselves fully to seeking and serving God, are in a position to blaze a trail that people in the world can then follow in their own way. It is for this reason that monastic practices such as extended periods of fasting, regular confession, and attendance at vigils took root and became normative for the church as a whole. They were not imposed from above. They grew up spontaneously from the piety of the people, who had encountered the holiness of the ascetics, either directly or through the reports of others, and wanted to seek it in their own lives. Likewise, the reading of saints' lives and veneration of the saints through their relics and icons became enormously popular. This was accompanied by a growth in the population of the saints to include not only martyrs and hierarchs, but outstanding ascetics, such as St. Anthony himself, and others who were models of Christian virtue. For our purposes, the details of these practices matter less than how they affected marriage. The monastic paradigm set before people in the world a new way of thinking about their married life, as the arena in which they had been called to pursue holiness. After all, one need not be a monk to practice charity, hospitality, forgiveness, and self-denial. The sacrifices of a mother in caring for her children, or of a father in providing for his family, may well take this form. The ancient way of thinking about marriage as a means of legitimizing children and providing mutual support was thus enriched by a new level of meaning. Marriage became a spiritual undertaking in a way it had not been before. This new level of meaning was eventually codified in the wedding service, which remains the most authoritative teaching of the Orthodox Church concerning marriage. Sex, as so integral a part of marriage, was naturally included in this process. But here the transformation was even more indirect, for the early Christians living in the hypersexualized culture of antiquity were well aware of the dangers of making an idol of sexual pleasure. Some continued to insist, as had some pagan moralists, that the only legitimate purpose for sex, even in marriage, is procreation. Yet there was an important countercurrent. St. John Chrysostom viewed sexual desire as having been given to humanity not only for procreation, but as a way of binding husband and wife together, despite the estrangement caused by the fall. He saw sexual pleasure in the same positive light, considering it as an extension of the desire for offspring. And here's a passage from St. John Chrysostom. How do husband and wife become one flesh? It is as if you were to take the purest part of gold and mingle it with other gold. So here also the woman, as it were, receives the richest part fused with pleasure, nourishes and cherishes it, and contributing her own share, restores it back as a man. The child is a sort of bridge, so that the three become one flesh, the child connecting on either side, each to the other. Therefore he said with accuracy, not that they shall be one flesh, but they shall be joined into one flesh. That's how it is in the Septuagint, namely that of the child. What then? When there is no child, will they not be two? On the contrary, their coming together has this effect. It diffuses and commingles the bodies of both. Just as one who has cast ointment into oil makes the whole one, so it is here. Elsewhere, Chrysostom takes it as obvious that intercourse into old age is not blamable, even though it can no longer produce children. Thus, in his view, married sexuality, even when it is incapable of producing children, retains its value as a kind of union and reconciliation of the two sexes. Despite the positive character of Chrysostom's views, they still place sex and sexual pleasure in a fundamentally biological light as natural concomitants of the desire to reproduce. Although the Church Fathers in the wedding service say much about the need for agape in marriage, they say little about the personal dimension of marriage that we today consider to be so important. The desire to love and be loved, to share intimate thoughts and feelings, and to be valued for what one truly is. And they certainly do not place sex in this context. This brings me to the second way in which Christianity performed an end run around the complex of assumptions that governed ancient thought about marriage. It did so by presenting a model of holiness even higher and more exalted than that of the ascetics. I have in mind, of course, the Virgin Mary. Her elevation to a central place in Christian life revolutionized how men thought about women, and thereby also how women thought about men and how both thought about marriage. Mary, of course, had been part of Christian teaching from the beginning. Prayers seeking her intercession have been found on papyri as early as the 3rd century. However, it was only with the rise of the monastic movement that she began to play a central role in Christian devotion. Church fathers such as St. Athanasius in the East and St. Ambrose in the West held her up as a model of a life of virginity that is devoted to God. The Christological debates of the 5th century gave her further prominence, particularly through the work of St. Cyril of Alexandria to identify Mary as the Theotokos, the Mother of God, came to be seen as essential to affirming the full divinity of Christ. It's in the wake of the Council of Ephesus in 431, which codified this decision, that we find the first great flowering of artistic and liturgical devotion to the Theotokos. Homilists emphasized that her purity derived from the presence of God within her womb. According to Theodotus of Ancyra, in a homily preached at the council, quote, "The stainless virgin was, as it were, burned pure through the approach of the divine and immaterial fire, so that henceforth she remained inaccessible to any carnal corruption." Theodotus also provides the first surviving example of praise directed to her through greetings, chairitismoi, such as, "Hail, joy, whom we have so long desired. Hail, brightness of the church. Hail, spiritual fleece of salvation. Hail, stainless mother of holiness." The importance of devotion to the Theotokos for relations between the sexes can hardly be exaggerated. Men were not accustomed to looking up to a woman as someone holier, purer, and mightier than they. There were pagan goddesses, to be sure, but like all the pagan deities, they were essentially personifications of aspects of nature. The Virgin Mary was a historical person, one who by receiving God in her womb had been burned pure and is now forever with her Son, where she intercedes on our behalf. Soon tales began to accumulate of the power of her intercessions. Some were of historic significance, such as when she saved Constantinople from the siege of the Avars in 626. Unlike the power of the virgin goddesses Athena and Artemis, hers derives directly from her embrace of her femininity as a mother. She is at once virgin, mother, and queen, one who embodies in herself everything that is both distinctively feminine and worthy of reverence. It was in learning to revere the Theotokos that men learned to revere women. I cannot enter into this subject fully here, for to do so would require discussion of courtly love and medieval romance, topics that are well beyond our scope. Suffice to say that devotion to the Theotokos enabled men to see women in all their femininity, not only as pleasure mates or potential mothers, but as fountains of goodness and spiritual wisdom. That is what enabled the slow growth of the kind of love that we call romantic. And it was what has led us today to see in marriage, including its sexual dimension, not only the possibility of pleasure, offspring, and a secure life together, but that of heart-to-heart communion. This is a powerful ideal, yet because of its very power, it is also dangerous. We are all aware that to seek romance is to court disappointment, and that even when found, romance can wither and die. Western literature is full of tales of people like Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina, who by seeking romance were led to disaster. The challenge has always been how to seek heart-to-heart communion, or at least something close to it, without undermining everything that the ancients rightly valued in marriage, its security, its stability, its fecundity, and not least its ethical and religious sanction. It is at this point that the wisdom of the Church's devotion to the Theotokos becomes most apparent. In honoring the Theotokos, men not only learned to honor women, they also learned to honor chastity. By this I mean not simply the rule of no sex outside of marriage, but the beauty and holiness of one who is pure in body and spirit. As I've argued elsewhere, the traditional rites devoted to the Theotokos, such as the akathist service sung during Lent, lead one to seek to be chaste and pure as she is, not out of conformity to a rule, but out of devotion to a person. This is important, for it means that when the Church brought the possibility of romance into the world, it did so in a distinct ethical context. Romance is rooted in chastity. To seek romance without honoring chastity is as foolish as to seek to grow fruit in a desert. It's to become another Anna Karenina, one who by grasping at false and enticing goods ends with nothing. Nothing. From this standpoint, we can understand not only the power of the Christian ideal of marriage, but also why it is today so endangered. We have kept the high ideals that Christianity brought into the world: equality of the sexes, romantic love, the yearning for heart-to-heart communion, and removed from them the ascetic and devotional practices that enabled them to be realized. To realize them takes virtues like patience, humility, forgiveness, and chastity, and these can be learned only through the very practices that generated these ideals in the first place. Having abandoned these practices, we are left with the ideals alone, apart from the underlying way of life that gave them harmony and integrity. What remains of sexual morality is widely perceived as merely a set of rules not to commit adultery, fornication, and so on. Such rules can be enough for people whose faith is strong and whose determination does not waver. But we should not be surprised that the rest of the world, not understanding their purpose, finds them arbitrary and oppressive. The answer lies in the union of the two views that I distinguished at the outset. We must recover the ancient practices of asceticism and devotion that gave Christian sexual ethics its original power. And we must do so, if not for the purpose of saving marriage, which might be rather grandiose, at least with a realization of their transformative power. This means coming to see how the rich and humane form of marriage, so well defended by Goroyan, depends upon the rigorous asceticism and devotion to chastity advocated by authors such as Baer. It is only within the unity of the Church that these can be recognized as different aspects of a single whole. Vigen Goroyan has made an important contribution to this process, and for that he deserves our thanks and appreciation. And that's all. Thank you for your patience. I think that was long discussion. So, questions or comments?
Could you revisit when the veneration of the Virgin Mary?
Well, it really flowered right after the Council of Ephesus in 431, which did declare as dogma that she is Theotokos. So at that council, there already was, great poetic exaltation of her as the Theotokos.
So that's just affirming what it already was in the tradition.
It was, but, she had been called Theotokos well before, and people prayed to her and venerated her. But in terms of sort of devotional intensity and the elaboration of the elaborate praises that we give to her now, I think that's roughly the starting point.
Hi, wonderful paper, David.
Okay.
In Pillar and Ground of Truth, Florensky sees sophrosune as key spiritual virtue. And he translates it as chastity, Russian word for chastity. And he's clear, he means this by mildness, moderation, harmonious soul, not at war with itself. This is not how we think of romantic love. It's
Right.
It's tumultuous and ecstatic. What is your model of romantic love that you think presupposes chastity?
Well, so again, I think to really delve into what is romantic love, you would have to look at the medieval romance literature and how that developed. We have a historian of medieval literature here who might want to comment, actually, but just so far as what I'm dealing with in the paper, I think what romantic love primarily is seeking is what I call here heart-to-heart communion.
Okay.
The sense of finding another who loves you fully for who you are, with whom you can sort of entrust yourself to share all of life together. And that's hard. right? And, we've all seen in countless movies and read novels of how this can go wrong. But nonetheless, it's a worthy ideal. And it is what the veneration of the Theotokos and the transformation of marriage that took place through the monastic movement, it's the possibility that they open up that had not existed before. It had not even been on anyone's horizon. When Plato talks about eros, which might be the closest thing to romantic love in antiquity, he's not talking about marriage at all.
I mean, even in the imagery of the church, Christ is the bridegroom. There's this sort of breathlessness, this sort of speechlessness.
Yeah.
That isn't sophrosune.
Well, yeah. So as far as chastity goes, the way I understand it, you really have two different Greek terms that are kind of synthesized into what we call chastity. Sophrosune is one of them, but sophrosune is primarily self-control, moderation. The other one is hagneia, which is originally meant ritual purity. It's the term used in the Septuagint for that, for things that are dedicated and set aside to God in the temple.
Okay.
But it then is transferred to the purity of someone who is devoted to Christ. And so chastity becomes this sort of fused virtue of dedication to Christ through self-control. Okay. And particularly in regard to sex, obviously. So, and partly that happens because they both end up getting these two Greek words end up translating by the same Latin word, castitas. So, which is the source of our word chastity.
Just quick
Oh.
comment on that. It seems that you were right that as a rule, this doesn't come into being for the whole church until after Ephesus. But it seems to me that the raw material for it is already there in the New Testament, both when Paul speaks about wanting to present the Corinthians as a chaste bride without any spot, or there's that kind of purity, and also the picture of the New Jerusalem who's been prepared and is spotless and takes on the glory of her husband and so on. So it's there. It just needs to be, I think, unpacked, and it's through the Theotokos that comes. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think in the early centuries, there wasn't a kind of an impulse to explore this subject very deeply because they were living in this hypersexualized culture and they had to be so keenly aware of all the pitfalls, right? But by the 5th century, you're living in a Christian society, and there's a lot more freedom to explore what Christianity really means, and that's, of course, what they did. So, but Father Paul?
Two things. Thank you for that wonderful paper. I was thinking when you said the combination of the two, you were speaking of that, I've told some of you here this story probably, but when I went to get married a while ago, my wife and we went to see an Orthodox priest, and he was talking with us before, while we were scheduling the wedding and so forth. This was out in Chicago. And so here I am, American. My wife is Russian, but she'd lived in the U.S. for a bit. And the priest, who was American, but it was a kind of Russian background church, he said, what's the most important thing in marriage? And so I said, love. And my wife said, respect. And then he yelled at us. He said, you're both wrong. And I was like, whoa. And then he said, it's commitment. And what he meant was commitment to each other and also commitment to Christ, as symbolized in the Orthodox service, when your hands are tied with the priest, the couple, going around in what's called the dance of Isaiah. So that was one thing. The other thing you were asking about the history of Mass, this is, I could go on way too long, so I'll just keep this really short because, so there are some Orthodox writers who talk about the Romance literature as having emerged after the schism, and they see it as paralleling the emergence of kind of legendary sort of, trending over time towards Baroque saints' lives, right? There was kind of a qualitative change in Western literature that involved more romance and saints' lives that were, of post-schism saints especially, that were kind of seen as, like really flowery and legendary and so forth. However, the Byzantine world, as you probably know, did originate what are sometimes called the first novels, which are heavily influenced by romance, even before, the schism, and then a bit more after, the era of the Crusades. But I think those did seem to kind of kick off the genre of the novel. They did have Christian elements. There was that element of romance, heart to heart, and also I think some symbolism related to Christianity as well. But it was a little bit like something like Beowulf in the West, where they were reimagining a pagan past before Christianity, but there were elements of Christian themes, about virtue and going through all kinds of adventures and challenges to be together with the person that you're going to marry. So that doesn't really exactly answer anything other than I think that there is poetically some evidence for that kind of merging of those two points of view that you were speaking of in those early romances.
Some of you may know the book by Kyle Harper called From Shame to Sin, that talks about the subtitle is The Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality in Antiquity. And he has a chapter about, so you had these pagan romances that often had a plot where roughly, there's some noble girl who's kidnapped and taken into slavery, and the brave hero rescues her. And, they're romantic, they're also rather superficial. And they sort of play on how true love can conquer adversity, can conquer bad luck, maybe bad fortune. But anyway, he says that the early church then had its own, if you will, anti-romances, which are the saints' lives of such as St. Mary of Egypt, of a woman who was a prostitute and then becomes holy through repentance and asceticism. So I think that was kind of a purification that we had to go through, the church had to insist upon, that we couldn't just it's kind of like living on candy, to just think romances can define for you what love and marriage are really all about. And so that's how the church did it. It insisted, no, unless you're willing to, take up the cross and follow me, and that may lead you into the desert, then what are you doing? But once that had been done, then the door was open to return to the romance, which they did in the 12th century, with these early Byzantine romances.
There was kind of a burst in the middle. They had been some of them earlier, though, too. But, I think the two attitudes you outlined, just real briefly to follow up, they're paralleled in attitudes, I think, within Orthodoxy towards literature and imagination in a more general way, right? That, you'll have some, when I was first coming into Orthodoxy, a monk priest who was very wonderful to me, but he found out I was doing graduate work in English, and he said, well, literature is demonic. And there, if you look this up, there are these kinds of thoughts, your imagination and fantasy are kind of functions of the fall, obviously I kind of negotiated, staying in literature and as a grad student. But on the other hand, you had someone like Father Seraphim Rose, who would say for converts in America, he would often recommend that they read Dickens novels, because he said he felt they needed to develop their sort of emotional quotient, affective side of themselves, So, I think in a way that somehow that's kind of mirroring or paralleling these two attitudes towards marriage, where you're trying to look for the Venn diagram there, right? And kind of on the one hand, be wary or skeptical, but on the other hand, also realize that there's some positive things here too.
Yeah. Well, candy is good.
Yeah.
In moderation. After dinner, not before, right?
There is this exceptional novella that became very, very popular in Christian circles as it fell out of popularity in Jewish circles, Joseph and Asenath. Probably written, my argument is that it's written in the late 1st century, and it's written in a Jewish context, but it has so much imagery that is shared between that stage of Judaism and Christianity, and probably was added to by Christian scribes as it came into the Christian. But it has for sure romantic love. I mean, she's smitten, and he gives to her the breath of life and the cup of immortality. And I mean, it has all this Christian imagery, but also there is the erotic dimension there as well. And it moves, of course, into her childbearing and so on. But it has the romantic dimension alongside the ascetic, because she scorns every man until she meets Joseph. She lives in a tower that not even a male child has entered. I mean, there's this real concentration upon her virginity, and he eschews her at the beginning because she's a Gentile whose mouth has blessed pagan gods, and so it's as though she's an adulteress. So there's this concentration of both on romance and on asceticism, coupled with what comes to be very clear Christian imagery. And it was so popular that it's found in appendices to several Bibles, both in East and West. The name Asenath is known everywhere in almost every nation, even though there's 4 verses where she's mentioned in Genesis. So it has to have been from tales like this. Mm-hmm. So, I'm not sure we know the whole story. I think you're able to trace a broad movement, but I think that on a popular level, we still could find the romantic ideal alongside the ascetic, and that would be my go-to there.
No, thank you. That's a good point.
So maybe, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. Maybe this will just help me understand where it lands. But I think in my mind, I associate the rise of an emphasis on romantic love with the eventual, there are lots of factors, but the eventual kind of capacity to separate procreative purposes from marriage. So if the point of marriage is something like heartfelt communion and living your life together, then that can be undertaken by 2 people of the same sex, man, woman. There could be a lot of permutations to that. And so I guess I'm wondering how if it does seem like, if you want to put an Orthodox twist on that, it could be combined with various forms of asceticism as well in those relationships. Mm-hmm. And so, so I guess maybe I'm wondering how is the romance supposed to be intrinsically procreative, or how does that work? Because it seems like to me romance is something that kind of can, lead you to get rid of the procreative aspect. Yeah.
Well, romance is not per se something good. Okay, there can be bad forms of romance. There can be, like I mentioned, Anna Karenina, right? That it's something that people can seek in very much the wrong way and end up doing horrible evil. So, as I see it, the most authoritative statement of Orthodox teaching about marriage is the wedding service itself, and it assumes that the couple are seeking children, or at least open to children. Now, whether God grants the children, that's always a further question. But there's no even mention of any possibility that you be married and deliberately avoid having children. Since you're an Aristotle scholar, I like to think of this in connection with, when Aristotle talks about what is pleasure, and he says that, so pleasure is something that accompanies completed activity. So you run a race, it's hard, you reach the finish line, and you're thrilled, you feel this rush of joy. Well, what's the relation of that to what you just did? Well, he says it accompanies the completed pleasure the way the bloom of youth accompanies being healthy and young, It's just a sort of thing that you don't really seek for its own sake, but it is nonetheless intrinsic to what you do seek. And romance, as I think it, is a little like that in relation to the things marriage is primarily for, which, is forming a household and raising children. And that's what's blessed in the marriage service, along with everything that entails, namely the self-sacrifice and the mutual fidelity, and everything else that we all know, right? And it doesn't say anything about romance. I mean, if you've been to an Orthodox wedding, it's not doing that. So that's all it is. And marriages can be pure and holy and blessed, where the romance may not be there at all for whatever reason, right? And that can happen for a million different reasons. So it's not something that's constitutive of marriage. But nonetheless, it can be good. So
I wonder if we're in a new, if we have aspects of, you were talking well about the earlier church and the situation with hypersexuality, in that time period. I wonder if there are elements of that in modern Western culture now, and how that may affect ways in which Orthodox culture responds to that, in relation to marriage. I don't know.
No, I think that's a very good point. We've been living on candy for a long time.
I think, the internet and cyber porn and everything else, virtual reality, and, what AI relationships now and everything, and then so what is the Orthodox response to all that, and will that alter a bit, how things have emerged in recent centuries? I mean, not alter the marriage service or basic things, but, that if there is some kind of quotient between romance and asceticism,
We're very unbalanced. Yes. And that's where Father Bear's essay, I was trying to be very even-handed. The truth is, I don't agree with Father Bear about a lot that he said. But I think the positive value of it is to emphasize the need for asceticism in marriage, and how it can be a kind of a martyric calling. It's interesting, Bear and Goroyan say exactly opposite things about the crowns of the wedding service. Goroyan says they're crowned as king and queen of the little church, that's their household. And Bear says these are just crowns of martyrdom, and that's all they are. But they're both, right? I mean, why does it have to be one or the other? They're both.
I just want to kind of add to what Father was saying. This is entirely anecdotal. I might be entirely wrong here, but my experience, I've stayed for extended periods in Romania and in Greece, sometimes summer length times and so forth. And I noticed two different, when I go to spend a lot of time in monasteries, two different ways that I would hear marriage and sexuality being spoken, very different in the two countries. And my thought was this, so in Romania is very socially conservative still, right? There's still a lot of taboo against couples living together over there without marriage, against homosexuality, things like that in the general culture, right? It just tends to be more socially conservative. And so there tended to be, when I would talk to different monks and nuns, and these topics would come up, they have a lot more positive view of marriage and sexuality. In Greece, in general, in a lot of places, it's become more socially progressive, and a lot more, the taboos have gone away. And when you go to the monasteries, the monks and nuns tend to have a more dour, more extremely ascetical, advice that they're giving their people. And you see that in the Ephraimite monasteries in America, for example, where it's well known.
Mm-hmm.
As manifestations coming right from Greece over here. So I don't have statistics to back it up. This is my own sense of traveling and spending time there for last years.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Just to piggyback, Father, I'd be curious about all the fathers in here. Similarly, just in the parish, there's still challenges with people getting married, particularly the young. Of course, there's people getting married later in life. But what I find when I kind of dig deep is you might think it's it's Orthodoxy, it's hard to find someone who's Orthodox, and it actually is that the undercurrent is still this romantic stuff that's still kind of driving the show. It's like we have Orthodox people meet each other just fine, but they're still playing this kind of cultural courtship game where things have to line up in such a way that it's like, you're my soulmate, this is the romantic story. And so I think it is a real serious challenge to, maybe even with these anecdotes here, like how do we almost tackle that where it's not so much, even someone being Orthodox would be just like this box I check. Where it's like, oh, are you Orthodox? Okay, now we can court now, or something like this. But again, anecdotally, just at the parish, I'm seeing, young people are struggling to get married. It seems precisely for this. These are one of the reasons. I mean, there's many other cultural things, the death of monoculture, et cetera, et cetera. But I definitely see this current in place.
So you're saying they're sort of too much in the grip of the romantic ideal?
I think so.
Yeah.
There's still like romantic expectations that come from the culture.
Soulmate.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, that's a term I did not use. I think it's totally